A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
On a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby, and Christopher Brohier is joining us today. He's Director of Policy and Research at the Australian Christian Lobby. Hey, Christopher, welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and good to be back. Good to be back on the day before Visionathon.
Hey, Christopher, there's so many things to talk about. We'll see if we can get through as much as we can. The list is longer than we can imagine, the things that are changing so dramatically. Let's start with something that's happened internationally, which has an impact here in Australia. The movement in relation to gender fluidity, and the UK is banning teaching in schools, the ongoing effect of the CAS inquiry, the Australian effort to stonewall the need for an inquiry, and the banning of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for kids. What's the latest that you can give us an update on?
So last week, Neil, the UK government moved to ban the teaching of gender fluidity in schools in the UK. Now, that's a massive development. Listeners would know that this doctrine is taught, this false doctrine, in our schools right from day dot. Children are taught in Australian schools that they can choose whether they're a boy or a girl, and nobody else can know. I'm just looking on the Northern Territory Health Department website, and it says, gender is how you see it and nobody can tell you. There's no right way or wrong way to express it. So the UK, on the back of the CAS review, which exposed the really harmful effect of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, there's no evidential basis for them, and the claim that's underpinned it all, that if you don't follow that course, children will suicide, has been exposed to be false. So the UK has stopped that sort of medicalisation, and now they've moved to the education system because there's obviously a perceived link. If you're teaching kids this from the age of innocence when they can't know any better, then the likelihood of problems developing is increased. So that's a major development internationally and in the UK.
Let me ask you something here. A couple of words that have come out in some recent ACL statements. The thought that there is a social contagion, that's an element that's attached to the idea of gender dysphoria. So when you get these sorts of ideological differences being taught in school, and it seems to be that the UK has recognised this, that a social contagion kicks in when you don't have some level of black and white way of being able to identify what gender is. Any thoughts here around those words?
Well, Neil, it's interesting for those readers who if you look at the Murdoch Press, the News Corp, they're running a campaign now called Let Them Be Kids. And the Australian and the other News Corp media are pushing for the age of access to social media to be lifted to 16. And in South Australia, a couple of weeks ago, the Premier announced that he's going to look at banning social media for kids under 14. So it's accepted very clearly out there. There's a massive effect of social media on kids, particularly teenage girls. Now that funnels in to the gender dysphoria epidemic, which has happened across the Western world. And the biggest presenters are prepubescent or early pubescent girls, a massive change. And Cass points out that there is very likely a link between the presentation of gender dysphoria and the use of the mobile phone. And she, in fact, points out that the rise of mental health problems for kids has spiked from 2010 to 2014 when smartphones became accessible. This, for our teenage kids, is the most anxious generation, and a subset of that is gender dysphoria.
Now, the Australian Christian Lobby, you're intensifying your advocacy for bans on puberty blockers for children and paediatric gender transition treatments, alongside this call for an inquiry into Australian gender treatments. How do listeners help to be a part of that intensifying program that you've got with the Australian Christian Lobby?
So we would love listeners across the country to contact their local state or federal MP, to contact their health minister or their premier, or even the prime minister, and say, we have to stop the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for kids, and we have to have an inquiry. The more we can get that message out to the local MPs, the more it's likely to have an effect on the ministers. The governments across the country are running a Stonewall campaign. They're saying Australia is not the UK. Back in 2020, the Australian Royal Society of Paediatricians said there's no problem here, and an inquiry might just cause more problem for these gender dysphoric kids. That is bad science. It's just, in the light of Cass, that cannot stand. We are wrongfully treating our kids. We are carrying out, in the light of Cass, a giant medical experiment with no benefit. And the only way we can break through this stone wall is for us, the people, to create a controversy with our MPs. Particularly, you've got the Northern Territory and Queensland with elections coming up. It'd be wonderful if people contacted their candidates and say, how you respond to this issue will determine how we vote. We have to make our voices heard.
So if you've got that image in mind, a stone wall, you've got to be able to break through it. And your encouragement there, Christopher, is to get with your local MPs, your state MPs, federal MPs, get into their headspace and make your understanding known about what's happening in our schools, and you might even have stories of children in your own community. Hey, you've got a visiting speaker coming, Chloe Cole, to raise some awareness around lies of the transgender ideology. What should we expect with her arrival?
So Chloe Cole is an American detransitioner. As a teenager, she so-called transitioned. She had a double mastectomy. And then as she went on a few years, she realized she'd made a tragic mistake. And she's bravely now become a spokeswoman for the detransitioners and for all kids. So she's appeared in American parliamentary inquiries. She's been on the various feeds like Jordan Peterson, etc. And she's coming here, and we're supporting her tour. She's going to be speaking in public meetings in Canberra, and so the information of that is on the ACL website, www.acl.org.au. So go there, you can register, you get a ticket, and we would love you, as many people as possible, to come, because this message has got to be heard. And I've been reading in the book of Ezra that God stirred up the heart of the king of Cyrus, and in Haggai at the same time, God stirred up the prophets, God stirred up the people. We want God to be using this to stir up people to take action.
So, Chloe Cole, keep your eye out for that tour. She's going to be in Canberra and South Australia and Queensland, and the acl.org.au website to be able to find some details about the Chloe Cole tour. Hey, let's turn some sights towards Tasmania. The Archbishop Julian Porteous, he wrote a pastoral letter entitled "We Are the Salt of the Earth," and he's raised the ire of LGBTQA activists and groups. What's the latest on that letter from your point of view?
So the thing I want to emphasize, Neil, is that he wrote and published the letter. That is a positive thing. And it sets out truth. It says, we, the people of God, are the salt and light of the earth. It says that truth is not negotiable, if you like. It's not, there can be your truth, my truth. We believe in objective revealed truth in the Holy Scriptures. And part of that is that marriage is between a man and a woman for life. Part of that is that God has made us male and female, binary. And then he goes on to say that there's now an attack to silence this truth. And he cites things like abortion, euthanasia, and the whole sex confusion movement. But then at the end, he talks about the Albanese government's moves to amend the Sex Discrimination Act and to proffer a Religious Discrimination Act, which will be a toothless tiger at present. And he says we have to have the ability to run our schools and our institutions according to Christian doctrine. And he calls upon the Albanese government to pull back from this course. So it's a wonderful demonstration of how a Christian leader should be speaking into the public space on these issues. Now, there's been the predictable reaction in Tasmania between the activists and MPs on their side, but that's not what I want to concentrate on. I want to concentrate on this fact that he has spoken publicly, and Christian leaders across the country have to keep speaking publicly these truths.
And, of course, Julian Porteous, no stranger to controversy. Lots of listeners will remember he was dragged through the courts in a very protracted legal battle some years back around the marriage issues that were going on back in the midway through the past decade. No stranger to controversy and the sort of backlash that he's been receiving. Let me just pick up on this for a few moments. You mentioned it. The thought of what's information, what's misinformation or disinformation. When you present biblical truth, someone on the activist side says that's misinformation. You've got to be actually quite aware of what you understand as truth if you're going to make sense of all of these debates, haven't you, Christopher?
Absolutely. We're at the stage now where the uttering of a fact is an offence. That's where we are in Australia. I think it was G.K. Chesterton that said that. So what's the response? One thing is to try to be nuanced in what we say. I'm not sure we can do that anymore. We just have to state the bold truth. And the more we do that, the better it is.
And you've got to be able to perhaps face a little bit of angst from some opposition there, but that's where a little bit of courage comes into play here. But standing for truth, that's something that we all have to be able to think about how we'll, and I guess being prepared in advance, knowing that if you're going to make a statement of truth, how you're going to respond if someone criticises you, and get ready for a little bit of opposition there. Hey, let me ask you about some upcoming elections. We're coming into an election season. The Northern Territory election coming up 24th of August. There's going to be an election in the ACT the 19th of October, and then it'll be Queensland's turn for a state election on the 26th of October. Preparations for those. What are the ACL team getting planned for building up of some opportunity to speak into those election campaigns, Christopher?
So starting with the NT, Neil, we've got a new state director in the Northern Territory, Nicholas Lay. He's doing an amazing job. And we're going to be focusing on the issue of religious freedom to run our schools according to our ethos, because last year the Northern Territory government took away all protections from the Anti-Discrimination Act, and the CLP, the Country Liberal Party, has said they will put back some of those protections. So that's a clear divide between the parties. And we don't campaign for any particular party, but we're telling people this is the choice, this is what the CLP have said. And we're rating the parties on that basis. So that's going to be our strategy, and we'll do some advertising, we'll do some letterboxing, and we'll run forums in the Territory and in Darwin, and make sure Vision goes up there, because it's great to be running a Vision program from Alice or near the Rock. How good would that be?
Hey, we're broadcasting into so many centres in the Northern Territory. Some of those Northern Territory listeners will be listening into our conversation right now saying, well, I'm going to have to try and keep up to date. So we're going to have to keep a little bit of flow of information around that Northern Territory election coming closer to that time, and no doubt when you're doing those pre-election Meet the Candidate forums, there'll be listeners who'll want to be there. Hey, let's talk about the ACT briefly. They've got an election coming up too on the 19th of October, and the ACT election, because it's a territory and it's a little bit like a city council state election type thing, any particular focus there for the ACT?
I think we'll be running a campaign there. Our state director is Joshua Rowe. He's actually on paternity leave. They had their first little baby son, Daniel, last week, so he's having a few weeks off. But so we'll be, again, there are a plethora of issues in the ACT. It's one of the most careless jurisdictions in terms of legislating. Like, for example, there's a significant decriminalisation of drug use in the ACT at a time when Oregon, which started this whole decriminalisation craze, has pulled back and they're recriminalising. We say, well, we'll make their same mistakes. It is just mindless legislating. So we hope to be drawing attention to some of these issues. And then, of course, Queensland's the big election this year. Our State Director, Rob Norman's working very hard. He's currently on a 10-day tour up the coast, visiting regional centres with Dave Pello from Church and State. He'll be running forums. Freedom for Faith is going to run forums, I think, in every electorate in Queensland. So there's a massive push to bring the issues before people and for listeners to understand that the Queensland Labor government, again, we're not partisan, but is proposing a diabolical Anti-Discrimination Act changes. These are some of the issues we have to consider. What policies will align most closely with truth and vote that way. Not vote according to your hip pocket, but vote according to truth.
Well, I think listeners, something resonates there when the ACL is referring to the current Queensland State Labor government as diabolical in some of their policy settings. That might mean that there's really a cause there to be in prayer for what's happening in the state of Queensland. Hey, let me ask you, I can't let you go without talking about the weekend Never Again Is Now rallies. What were your impressions of what happened in Melbourne?
Well, it's very interesting, Neil, that there have been weeks of protests by the anti-Semitic side, but there was, when the Never Again rally had movement had their rally on the steps of Parliament House, there was significant counter-protest. The police had to forcibly restrain people. There was a lot of animus and a lot of really implied violence, if you like call it, and that is just not on. It should not be on in Australia. Fair enough, you want to protest, and fair enough, you want to criticize Israel. You keep quiet when the other side, when the side is speaking for Israel.
So the Christian-sponsored Never Again Is Now rally, and there's one little point I picked up on one 84-year-old Jewish woman who declined to be named out of fear for her safety, was separated from her group and repeatedly poked and called a Zionist pig by protesters whose faces were covered. It gives you a little bit of an impression as to the sort of animosity that was there in that rally on the weekend. Hey, I think that draws us to a close for now. Always good getting your insights. Let me point listeners. There's been a number of different issues that you can follow through with your local MP, and you're saying, well, I've forgotten all that detail. Where do I find it all? Well, you might go and find some great resource to understand what's going on in the nation at acl.org.au, the website of the Australian Christian Lobby. And with all of those elections that are coming up, no doubt there'll be an opportunity too for you to connect with some of the activities that the ACL will be involved in, whether it's the Northern Territory or the ACT or the state of Queensland. acl.org.au, and no doubt you'll be able to connect there with Christopher Brohier as well. Pass on a note. Christopher Brohier is Director of Policy and Research at the Australian Christian Lobby. Christopher, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil, and support Vision tomorrow.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.